Alberta and British Columbia are Canadian provinces with absolutely stunning nature. And they used to be the perfect getaway from all the construction work happening in major cities. That was until a huge project worth over 30 billion Canadian dollars kicked off. A massive amount of drilling was involved, including digging a tunnel through a mountain with a tunnel boring machine. During this work, over 10.6 million cubic feet of dirt was dug out. They were also building tunnels under rivers, roads, and railroads. There was enough noise to annoy both the locals and the indigenous people. Ecologists, of course, also got involved since the project could unexpectedly harm orcas. But after the construction finished, the project quickly started bringing huge benefits to all of Canada. In the long run, the whole oil industry in the country will improve. And most importantly, Canada will become less dependent on the U.S. Now let's figure out what disturbed the peace of the residents of Alberta and British Columbia. Around the middle of the last century, large oil fields were found in Alberta, a province of Canada that borders British Columbia. Skipping ahead, it's important to say that the oil fields discovered in Alberta turned out to be the richest in the province, while just a year before the find, the region's reserves were pegged at 72 million barrels. By 1957, the number had soared to 3 billion barrels. In short, the reserves were huge. The Canadians reached them just in time, because by 1946, the country was producing only 21,000 barrels of oil a day, while consuming 10 times more. Just a few years after the wells were discovered and production ramped up, the Canadians had an idea to meet the oil needs of their coastal western province, British Columbia, which at the time was importing oil from the U.S. for its development. They could also sell oil to their southern neighbors since the states were booming in the post-war years, especially the areas near the Canadian border. However, there was one obvious issue. Alberta's black gold was a pain to deal with, mainly because moving the resource overland to the U.S. wasn't all that efficient. Hauling it to nearby British Columbia via railroad tracks or highways wasn't much better either. So the decision was made. The perfect solution would be a pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia called Trans Mountain, or TMPL. Construction kicked off in 1952. The job obviously wasn't an easy one because they had to lay a man-made river of oil through mountains, hills, prairies, and all sorts of other not-so-construction-friendly terrains, which there were plenty of, especially considering the pipeline stretched for 714 miles. Still, the Canadians badly needed the infrastructure for the resource, so just a year later, in 1953, the project was wrapped up and the new oil route was put to use. Crude oil from Edmonton, Alberta started flowing to refineries in the Vancouver area and the U.S. Northwest. At the pipeline's opening ceremony, the then Premier of British Columbia said that the total cost of TMPL was $93 million. Honestly, for infrastructure like that, it's not a lot. But the benefit, obviously, turned out to be just incredible. Despite all its benefits, by the 1980s, people started thinking that Trans Mountain wasn't competitive or efficient enough, and all because the pipeline could only move crude oil. But by then, there was already a way to turn it into a versatile transport route able to carry both crude and refined products. In fact, the necessary upgrades were made pretty soon, and by 1985, TMPL was already moving petroleum products 509 miles from Edmonton to Kamloops. By 1993, this option became available for deliveries all the way to the end of the line. Aviation fuel, gasoline, and diesel fuel were being sent to Vancouver. At that time, the capacity was 260,000 barrels or 1.4 million cubic feet per day. Then in 2004, the Canadians made another upgrade, boosting the capacity to 300,000 barrels or 1.7 million cubic feet per day. As a result, by the early 2010s, Canada had achieved the goals the pipeline was originally built for. British Columbia was conveniently supplied with oil, plus the black gold from oil-rich Alberta was heading toward the northwestern U.S., but there was a catch. Just imagine, 98% of all oil produced in Canada goes straight to the States. Most of it comes from Alberta and is heavy oil, since it's extracted not from regular fields but from sand. This kind of oil is harder to refine and transport, which is why its price is generally lower than that of light oil. However, since most of it heads to the U.S., Canada's southern neighbor has a lot of power over setting the price, and they definitely use that power, pushing prices down, of course. For example, around 2018 to 2019, prices dropped so much that heavy Canadian oil was almost $50 cheaper per barrel than U.S. light oil. There just wasn't enough capacity in the existing Trans Mountain pipeline to send oil to other countries. It was already taken up with current deliveries. A study by IHS Markit carried out in 2020 showed that the lack of export pipeline capacity cost Canada $14 billion between 2015 and 2019. On top of that, it's worth mentioning that Canada, even without knowing what trade spats with the U.S. would kick off in 2025, had already been thinking that it was way too dependent on exporting oil to the States. Let's not forget it, very good prices, and that's a dependency Canada needs to break free from. In 2013, the Canadian National Energy Board received an application from Kinder Morgan, the owner of the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline. It included a proposal to expand the current Trans Mountain Pipeline by building a parallel pipe from Edmonton to Burnaby, just east of Vancouver. The overall length of the expansion is about the same as the original pipeline, and the cost is $6.8 billion. That number sounds big, but it's only the beginning. Work on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, known as TMX, kicked off in 2019. On this map, you can instantly see where, how, and what needed to be done according to the plan. So for instance, building it was much simpler than if we were putting in an entirely new pipeline. Some segments, shown here in green, weren't newly constructed, but were built long ago and then deactivated. So they just had to be brought back online. Still, this is just 120 miles in total, only 2 small sections, so the whole TMX project didn't get that much easier because of it, because the rest of the 614 miles were laid down anew, across all this pretty rough terrain, especially the mountains. One of the sections where work was underway ran through mountainous terrain. While working, the builders had to stay at an altitude of about 4,300 feet above sea level, and they were tackling tasks that were anything but easy. They had to place segments of the pipeline and then connect them. All in all, even at this point, it's safe to say that creating a new channel for Canadian oil was no walk in the park. One of the construction spots at the very end of the pipeline in the city of Burnaby required building a tunnel. No, scratch that. A huge tunnel in the classic Chinese style, where the mountain gets drilled through to clear the way. The challenge here started with the fact that you can't dig a tunnel through a mountain by hand. You need some serious equipment. For example, a tunnel boring machine. One of these machines was delivered to the construction site at Burnaby Mountain, and then it got to work. It came in from Germany. You'll often see Heron Connect, one of the best-known builders of tunnel boring machines, show up in our videos. In Canada, they chose not to come up with something new and instead went with a proven solution. The machine stretched 400 feet, was operated by a 12-person team, and cost about $10 million. A whole lot of other earth-moving machines were also brought in, along with all kinds of other equipment, plus a bunch of workers. All of this ran 24/7, and specifically the path through the mountain was being carved in 2 shifts of 10 hours each. And just take a look at what's around this mountain. Yep, people live here. Now imagine how annoyed the locals must have been with a tunneling machine and hundreds of workers constantly buzzing around, along with all the not-so-pleasant noises from other equipment. Still, when it came to building this tunnel, the people living nearby were luckier than usual. The thing is, a noise management plan was put together for the tunnel construction, which included mitigation measures in line with federal and provincial guidelines. That meant using barriers for noisy equipment, screens, and anything else that could help keep the noise from spreading beyond the construction site. Light control worked the same way. It could also be a nuisance for locals. And of course, as part of building this tunnel, they tried to minimize the environmental impact caused by different types of waste. For instance, they used water and soil stabilization to keep wind erosion in check on damaged spots, especially when traffic and windy conditions kicked up too much dust. The stronger the wind got, the more often dust control measures had to be taken. It was an obvious move since the tunnel boring machine alone dug out about 1.4 million cubic feet of soil during the project. Plus, another 10.6 million cubic feet were excavated just to get ready for the drilling, to build the entry, exit, and other sections of the mountain tunnel. So once again, it's clear that a full-on dust control campaign was absolutely needed. At least on paper, building the tunnel through Burnaby Mountain looks perfect. Well, aside from the fact that all this stretched the timeline a lot, just putting together one underground path took a year and a half. Then, inside this tunnel, they installed 3 30-inch pipelines which connected 2 terminals, the first one on the streets of Burnaby and the second for loading ships at Westridge. Yeah, you could say this tunnel is the final and one of the most crucial parts of the whole expansion, because after that, it's just transferring oil onto tankers and shipping it by sea. For most of the length of the new pipeline, Canadian contractors did the work. They buried the pipes, cleared space for them, built new routes, and brought deactivated pipes back into operation. But there were stretches that posed certain engineering, geotechnical, and construction challenges, which called for expertise that simply wasn't available in Canada. For example, right here, between Hope and the Coquihalla Summit, the main TMX project manager just shrugs it off with a quick, "We're running grades of 30 degrees up here," but in reality, it's way trickier because the terrain itself is a massive headache. That's why for this project, they brought in an Italian company, and experts from other countries too. Altogether, the project included 52 trenchless crossings done using horizontal directional drilling, covering a total of 28 miles. It's not just about laying pipes, it's about using a drilling rig to create an underground passage with minimal impact on the environment. Out of these, 35 were river crossings, meaning the path was drilled underneath a river. One of them, for example, was the crossing over the Fraser River. A total of 0.9 miles took 5 months due to, as claimed, underground conditions. At the same time, it was simply impossible to implement this segment of the route any other way. This is directly stated by the project participants. 24 crossings were made over roads or highways and another 3 over railways. In addition to the major trenchless crossings, the project also completed another 557 smaller crossings of the same type. Now, let's recall the serious measures taken to reduce light, noise, and dust pollution while building the tunnel through Mount Burnaby. Around 20% of all crossings were in densely populated areas, which meant there were tons of strict requirements, not only for noise, light, and dust, but also for land conditions, ecology, and everything else. So by May 2024, the project was finished. But some questions remain, like those about funding. Do you remember that initially in 2013, the cost of expanding the pipeline was set at $6.8 billion? Then the government bought the entire Trans Mountain from Kinder Morgan, started the expansion, and by February 2020, the project was estimated at $12.6 billion. The twofold increase in cost, as stated, was linked to the rise in expenses for labor, steel, and land. By February 2022, news came out that costs had increased even further by 70%, from $12.6 to $21.4 billion. Among the reasons was the price hike caused by COVID-19. In March 2023, it was announced that costs had gone up again, reaching $30.9 billion. Then on May 1st, 2024, when the pipeline expansion was finally completed, it turned out that the costs had reached 34 billion Canadian dollars. In general, the project had a long journey from $6.8 to $34 billion, a whole field for various investigations and disputes. However, we won't get into that, and we'll just say, even despite its colossal final cost, TMX, or the Trans Mountain Expansion, brought huge benefits to Canada. Before the expansion, the system's capacity was about 300,000 barrels, or 1.7 million cubic feet per day. The expansion turned the pipeline system into a route where 890,000 barrels, or 5 million cubic feet of resources, can now move daily. That's almost a threefold increase. The first thing to note after the project is completed is that Canada's finally managed to reduce the discount on benchmark heavy crude oil, which at the time the expansion went into operation cost $13.50 less per barrel than American oil. Yes, it doesn't seem like much because the discount hasn't disappeared completely, just dropped to less than $10 per barrel. However, Canada doesn't sell just one barrel of oil, but thousands, which makes the overall benefit really noticeable. At the same time, thanks to the expansion, Canada will simply be able to sell even more black gold. The country has already increased its production to 5.4 million barrels per day, and by December 2025, production will rise to 5.6 million barrels. Before the expanded pipeline opened, a huge amount of oil reserves had built up in Alberta, 42 million barrels. All the owners were clearly sitting there eagerly waiting for the new route to open so they could finally sell their reserves. As we've already mentioned, one of the main goals of the pipeline expansion is to reduce dependence on the U.S. This, of course, will also be achieved to some extent in the long run. Just a short time after the expanded pipeline opened on May 20th, 2024, an oil tanker had already docked at the Westridge terminal, loading around 550,000 barrels of crude for delivery to China. This event marked a literal new era in Canadian oil trade because now large volumes of oil can head to Asia. China, in its current state, is hardly going to turn down a ton of Canadian black gold. Other countries need this resource too. For example, India, which before the expanded pipeline even started operating, already bought 2 million barrels of oil going through Trans Mountain. By the way, this was actually the first such purchase. The U.S. probably doesn't like all this, but there is some good news for them. Now, more oil can be sent to the west coast of the states through the West Ridge Terminal. If the project had been completed earlier, the oil export from Canada would probably have a different structure by now, with much less involvement from the U.S., but there were some delays. In particular, there were a lot of disputes with the indigenous people living in the area where the work was happening. Protests from indigenous people have been happening since the ideas about expansion first appeared, and they continue to this day, simply because the people living here don't like construction work on sacred land, especially if that work involves oil, which tends to spill and cause irreparable damage to the environment. And many non-indigenous locals also joined the protests because, obviously, they didn't like the project either. The expanded pipeline has started operating, so it can be concluded that the protests didn't lead to anything. Yes, the project wasn't canceled because it's too important for Canada as a whole. However, indigenous peoples and locals still managed to ensure that the construction caused as little harm as possible to the local environment. As we talked about earlier today, a lot of the project implementation was focused on reducing noise and light pollution, as well as cutting down on dust that can disrupt both people's and animals' lives. In a way, this also shows that the protests had an impact. Another group strongly opposing the project were environmentalists and regular people who care about the fate of nature. They focus not so much on the pipeline itself, but on how the increased oil traffic would make the shores of Vancouver too hot a place. It's claimed that the number of oil tankers in the region would rise nearly sevenfold to 408 per year, and this could seriously harm the local creature, the orca. In the late 60s and early 70s, dozens of orcas were caught and sold to aquariums and theme parks around the world, and those who remained were exposed to chemicals used in local industries. An increase in the number of tankers means more physical and acoustic disturbances in the water. Experts say the noise from the propeller and engine is at a frequency that can mask the communication of whales. This means it could disrupt their ability to hunt for food. At the same time, according to research, this species is already starving. The body shape of many orcas has changed. There's a lack of fat deposits, which means a reduced food intake. As always, a big project is a set of dilemmas related to both the local population and nature. However, due to its advantages, the pipeline just can't be shut down. Too much time and effort have been spent.